I didn't steal anything.
Then who did?
I don't know for certain, but I know who was there.
You will never repeat that to Eric.
He thought the call had disconnected. Instead, it had only just begun listening. Eric Bond lowered the phone from his ear as the elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor of Bond Tower, the Chicago skyline burning gold behind acres of glass. Somewhere below, the lake caught the last of the light and turned it to hammered copper. He had spent 11 hours in meetings that day, and for the first time since boarding his flight home, his shoulders loosened. Melanie Walsh had just finished telling him she loved him. It was the kind of sentence that used to settle something in his chest. Tonight it did, for about 11 more seconds. They had spoken for 6 minutes about flower arrangements and a guest list that kept growing past 300 names, about whether the string quartet should play during cocktail hour or wait for the reception. Melanie's voice had been warm, easy, threaded with the soft laugh she used when she wanted him to picture her smiling. Eric had smiled too, alone in the elevator, thinking that for a man who trusted almost no one, he had finally found the one exception worth making. He reached to end the call. His executive assistant, Diane, appeared at the elevator door with a folder and an apology already forming on her lips. A contract from the Hartwell acquisition needed his signature before the courier left for the night. Eric shifted the phone without looking, sliding it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, already reaching for the pen Diane held out. He didn't check the screen. He didn't hear the small chime that would have told him the call was still live. For a few seconds there was only the rustle of fabric against the phone's speaker, muffled footsteps, the low hum of the building's climate system. Then Melanie's voice returned. It had no warmth left in it at all. "You need to remember something, Bella." The words were flat, precise, aimed like a blade. "This house belongs to people like us. You work here." Eric's pen stopped moving mid-signature. He knew the voice on the other end before she even answered. Bella Lewis, the young woman who had kept his household running with a quiet competence he'd noticed only in passing. Her reply came soft, careful, the tone of someone choosing every word like it might be used against her later. "I understand that, ma'am. I've always understood that." "Then explain," Melanie said, "why my grandmother's necklace disappeared from my dressing room the same week you started paying too much attention to things that don't concern you." "I didn't take it." Bella's voice didn't rise. "It didn't break either. I didn't take anything." "Then who did?" Pause. Long enough that Eric, standing motionless in his own foyer with a pen still hovering over a contract he could no longer read, found himself holding his breath along with her. "I don't know for certain," Bella said finally. "But I know it wasn't me. And I think you know that too." Melanie's laugh came thin and sharp, nothing like the sound he'd heard 6 minutes earlier. "You think I'm going to let a maid stand in my house and imply I'm lying? I'm not implying anything, ma'am. I'm only telling you the truth." "The truth," Melanie repeated, "is that you're going to take responsibility for this quietly tonight, or I promise you, no household in this city will ever hire you again. Do you understand what I'm capable of?" Diane was still speaking beside him, something about the courier, about a second signature page, but Eric heard none of it. He set the pen down without looking at her. His eyes had gone somewhere past the glass, past the skyline, past the version of his life he'd believed was finally settled. Then Bella said the sentence that changed everything. "I didn't take it, ma'am. But I know who did." Silence swallowed the line. Eric stood very still in the marble foyer of his own penthouse, phone warm against his ribs, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he was no longer listening to his fiancée scold an employee. He was listening to a woman being threatened into confessing to a crime she hadn't committed. And whatever Bella knew, it frightened Melanie enough to make her voice shake at the edges, just slightly, just enough for a man trained to read people for a living to catch it. "You will not repeat that to anyone," Melanie hissed. "Not to Eric. Not to Eleanor. Not to a single soul in this house. If you do, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." Bella said nothing. Eric imagined her standing in that hallway, absorbing the threat the way she seemed to absorb everything, without flinching, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. He should have said something. Should have announced himself, ended the charade, demanded an explanation right there. Instead he did the only thing that felt like it might get him closer to the truth. He said nothing at all. He let the call run until it finally, mercifully, disconnected on its own, and then he stood in his foyer for a long time, staring at a phone that had just shown him a version of the woman he was about to marry that no one, not the press, not his board, not even his own instincts, had ever warned him about. He had heard cruelty before. He had built a career reading it in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the careful smiles of men who wanted something from him. But he had never heard it aimed at someone who had absolutely nothing to threaten back with, someone who chose honesty anyway at what sounded like real cost. Eric didn't call Melanie back that night. He didn't confront anyone. He poured a drink he didn't touch and sat by the window until the skyline blurred into a smear of gold and black, turning one question over and over until it had worn a groove into him. What does Bella Lewis know that terrifies my fiancée this much? Whatever it was, he intended to find out, quietly, carefully, the way he did everything that mattered. If you've ever had a moment where one overheard sentence changed how you saw someone completely, you already know what Eric was about to walk into. Stay with me. Chapter 2 takes you back 48 hours into the world Bella lived in before that phone call ever happened, and nothing about her is what you'd expect. 48 hours earlier, Bella Lewis stepped off the city bus a few minutes before 6 in the morning, tightening her gray cardigan against a wind that still carried the last chill of spring. Ahead of her, the iron gates of the Bond estate rolled open the way they did every weekday, revealing a driveway lined with old oaks and a house built from pale limestone and glass that looked, in the early light, less like a home than a promise someone had made and kept. She paused at the gate the way she always did, one breath in and out, and reminded herself gently that this place was not hers. She was trusted to care for it. That was different from belonging to it, and Bella had learned a long time ago not to confuse the two. Inside, she traded her cardigan for a pressed black uniform with a white collar, twisted her hair into a neat low bun, and reported to Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the head housekeeper, a woman whose exacting standards were softened only by her fairness. In 4 months, Bella had never missed a shift, never left a task half-finished, never once given Mrs. Brooks a reason to raise her voice. She had a gift for noticing what others missed: a crooked frame, wilting flowers, a coffee mug left behind before sunrise, and she used that gift quietly, the way she did most things. Few of the staff knew what waited for her at the end of each shift. After the last task was finished, Bella rode another bus across the city to the small apartment she shared with her younger brother, Marcus, a first-year engineering student whose scholarship covered tuition and nothing else. She picked up every extra hour she could, because every extra hour meant another month of groceries, another semester Marcus didn't have to worry. She had once had her own plans, a certification program in property management, a life built around her own name instead of someone else's household, and she had folded those plans away without complaint, telling herself there would be time later. Her kindness rarely announced itself. The groundskeepers found cold water waiting near their equipment on brutal afternoons and never learned who left it. The elderly driver, Mr. Owusu, found warm muffins wrapped in wax paper on mornings he had early runs. When the kitchen staff fell behind, Bella showed up to help without being asked and without expecting thanks. She believed, quietly and completely, that the truest form of dignity was the kind no one was around to praise. Eric Bond had noticed her only in passing during those 4 months, a shape moving efficiently through hallways, a name he associated with things simply working the way they should. He had crossed paths with her a handful of times, always brief, always professional. She stepped aside when he passed, lowered her eyes out of habit rather than fear, and returned to her work as if his presence changed nothing about her day. He appreciated that. He'd built his entire empire around people who valued competence over attention, and something about the house felt steadier whenever she was in it, though he could not have told you why. Melanie Walsh had noticed her too, but not the way Eric had. Melanie's public self was flawless. She could walk into a gala and hold a room without raising her voice, could speak about equity and compassion with a conviction that made donors reach for their checkbooks. Inside the house, though, her warmth operated on a strict, invisible ledger, extended only to those who could be useful to her, withdrawn instantly from anyone who wasn't. Bella did not flatter her. Did not fear her either, not in the way Melanie seemed to expect. And worse than either of those things in Melanie's eyes, Bella noticed. She noticed when guests arrived that weren't on any official calendar. She noticed which rooms Melanie preferred to be alone in and for how long. She said nothing about any of it, it wasn't her business, and she'd built her entire reputation on staying out of things that weren't, but Melanie had begun to watch her the way a person watches a door they suspect isn't fully locked. Then, on a Tuesday evening, Melanie's grandmother's necklace disappeared from her private dressing room. It was a heavy old-world piece, insured for more than Bella made in 3 years, meant to anchor the wedding jewelry collection Melanie had been assembling for months. Bella had been cleaning the hallway outside that same dressing room less than an hour before the theft was discovered. She was, by simple proximity, the easiest person in the house to suspect. And she had no idea, standing there answering Mrs. Brooks's gentle, careful questions, that the missing necklace was about to become the least important thing happening inside that house, or that the woman asking her to account for her whereabouts already knew, with total certainty, exactly where the necklace had gone. Melanie did not accuse Bella directly. That would have been careless, and Melanie Walsh was never careless in front of witnesses. Instead, she performed concern. She told Eric, over a quiet dinner, that she didn't want to jump to conclusions about anyone on staff, that she trusted the household completely, that she was sure there was a simple explanation. Eric, still unaware of anything beneath the surface, found himself admiring how measured she sounded, how unwilling she was to condemn someone without proof. Privately, it was a different performance entirely. Melanie pressed Mrs. Brooks to question Bella formally, framing it as procedure rather than accusation. Bella answered every question calmly. She had been in the hallway, yes. She had not entered the dressing room. She had seen someone else leaving it, briefly from a distance, someone she couldn't fully identify in the low evening light. But she remembered one detail clearly, a flash of silver at the wrist. Cufflinks, distinctive, the kind worn by men who moved in Eric's business circle rather than household staff. Bella assumed reasonably that it must have been one of Eric's associates passing through on some errand she wasn't privy to. She said as much to Mrs. Brooks, carefully, without naming anyone, because accusing a stranger of theft based on a glimpse of jewelry felt like exactly the kind of mistake that could end her employment permanently. Then she discovered something that unsettled her more than the missing necklace itself. The hallway camera outside Melanie's private wing had gone dark for several minutes that same evening, a gap in the footage that the security log attributed to a routine maintenance glitch. Bella knew enough about the house's systems, from years of overhearing the security staff, to know that routine outages didn't usually align so precisely with the exact window something valuable went missing. Someone had built a blind spot. On purpose. Melanie noticed the shift in Bella almost immediately, the new caution in her expression, the way she'd started double-checking who was nearby before she spoke. Melanie's treatment of her sharpened in response, moving from cool to something closer to a warning. "You should be very careful," Melanie told her one evening, alone in the hallway, her voice pleasant enough that anyone passing would have heard nothing but small talk, about remembering things that don't concern you. Bella said nothing. She had already understood, days earlier than Melanie realized, that this had stopped being about a necklace. When Eric returned from his trip, Melanie greeted him exactly as she always had, warm, affectionate, full of small complaints about caterers and seating charts that made her sound, to anyone listening, like a woman entirely consumed by wedding planning and nothing else. She had no idea her fiancé had heard every word of a conversation she believed had ended in privacy. Eric played along. It cost him more than he expected. He watched her hug him and found himself cataloging the gesture the way he cataloged a contract clause, looking for what was performance and what was real, and hating how difficult it had suddenly become to tell the difference. Every warm word from her now arrived with an asterisk attached. He watched the house differently too. He noticed for the first time, the way Bella tensed almost imperceptibly whenever Melanie entered a room. He noticed Mrs. Brooks steering certain conversations away from him with practiced ease. He had spent years training himself to read rooms full of strangers for a living, and it unsettled him to realize how much had been happening inside his own home that he'd simply failed to see. So he began quietly to look. He requested the household security logs under the pretense of a general system review. He examined employee schedules, access records, the full timeline surrounding the missing necklace. He found the same gap in the hallway footage that Bella had noticed days earlier, and unlike Bella, Eric had the authority to ask why it existed. What he found next stopped him cold. Melanie had told him weeks ago that she'd spent that particular evening at a charity planning meeting across the city. The estate's gate log told a different story. Her car had never left the property. Eric sat with that discrepancy for a long time before he called his head of security into his study and asked a single, quiet question. "Who else has access to the camera system besides us?" The answer he received was the first real thread in an investigation that would, within days, unravel far more than a stolen necklace. Eric found Bella in the small staff pantry off the kitchen, refilling a tray of coffee cups before the morning rush. He asked Mrs. Brooks to give them a moment alone, and he watched something flicker across Bella's face. Not guilt, he realized. Fear. The specific, learned fear of someone who understood exactly how little power she had if this conversation went wrong. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," he said, keeping his voice level, deliberately gentle. "I want to know what you actually saw the night the necklace disappeared." Bella hesitated long enough that he almost repeated himself. Then she told him, carefully, the way she seemed to do everything, about the figure she'd glimpsed leaving Melanie's dressing room, dressed too formally to be staff, the silver cufflinks catching the hallway light. She told him about the camera gap, about her suspicion that it hadn't been an accident. Then she told him the part she'd been most afraid to say out loud. Moments after the figure left, she'd heard Melanie's voice through the cracked door, low and urgent, speaking to someone Bella never saw. He must never know about tonight. Eric felt something settle in his chest like a stone dropping through still water. A secret meeting. Inside his own house. Hidden from him specifically. "Who is he?" he asked. "I don't know," Bella said honestly. "I only heard the sentence. I wasn't trying to listen. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I've regretted it every day since." He asked then the question that had been sitting underneath everything else. Why hadn't she told anyone sooner? Why let suspicion fall on her rather than explain what she'd seen? Bella's answer came quietly, and it was not the answer he expected. She wasn't protecting Melanie. She was protecting someone else. A younger kitchen assistant who had also glimpsed part of that same encounter and been quietly, viciously threatened afterward. The girl was 17, supporting a sick mother, terrified of losing the only job keeping her family afloat. Bella had absorbed the suspicion herself rather than risk that girl's livelihood by naming what she knew. Eric sat with that for a long moment. He had come into this conversation looking for a witness. He was leaving it having met someone who had spent weeks quietly shielding a stranger from consequences that should never have existed in the first place, at real cost to herself. "From this moment forward," he told her, "no one in this house is going to punish you for telling the truth. I mean that." He did not tell her yet that he'd already heard Melanie's voice threatening her through a phone call that was never supposed to still be connected. There would be time for that. First, he needed proof that would hold up to more than his own certainty. The investigation widened faster than Eric expected, and it led him somewhere he hadn't anticipated, directly into his own company. Adrian Cole had been a trusted associate for nearly a decade, a man Eric had brought in on some of his most sensitive acquisitions, someone he'd never once had reason to doubt. But the access logs, cross-referenced with Melanie's schedule, told a story neither of them had planned for Eric to ever see. Private meetings. Late hours. Locations that made no sense for a wedding planning relationship and made perfect, chilling sense for something else entirely. His first assumption was the obvious one, an affair. The truth, when it surfaced, was worse for the business than for his heart. Melanie had been feeding Adrian details about Eric's pending acquisition of a mid-sized hospitality group, information that could let a well-positioned buyer manipulate the company's valuation before the deal closed. It wasn't romance driving the secrecy. It was money and leverage and a scheme that had been running quietly for months, hidden behind wedding invitations and cake tastings. The missing necklace, Eric now understood, had never been about a necklace at all. It was cover, a convenient, emotionally charged accusation designed to get Bella dismissed from the household before she could piece together what she'd accidentally witnessed. Remove the witness, and the secret meetings simply became rumors no one could substantiate. Melanie, sensing Eric's questions had shifted from curious to precise, grew more careful. She tried, gently at first, to convince Bella that resigning for a fresh start would be best for everyone. Bella declined, politely and firmly. When that failed, Melanie produced a piece of manufactured evidence, a receipt conveniently discovered that seemed to place Bella near a pawn shop days after the theft. Eric recognized it immediately for what it was. Sloppy, rushed, exactly the kind of mistake a person makes when they're no longer fully in control of the story they're telling. He understood, finally, the true shape of the danger in front of him. Melanie wasn't simply unkind to people beneath her on a household org chart. She was actively, deliberately dismantling an innocent woman's life to protect a scheme that reached into the heart of his business. He decided it was time to stop watching. It was time to build a trap. Eric told Melanie, over a carefully casual dinner, that the household investigation into the missing necklace was nearly finished, that a security drive containing the final evidence would be moved to the private office on the second floor by the end of the week. He watched her face as he said it, and beneath her practiced calm, he saw the flicker of relief he'd been counting on. She believed she was still in control. 2 nights later, once the house had gone quiet, his security team watched Melanie slip down the hallway toward the office, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd done this kind of thing before. She searched the room methodically, working through drawers and cabinets with a precision that told Eric this wasn't her first quiet search of his private spaces. She wasn't alone for long. Adrian appeared in the doorway less than 10 minutes later, and the conversation that followed, captured in full by the very cameras Melanie had once known how to disable, revealed a partnership already fracturing under its own weight. Adrian accused her of dragging out the deception longer than necessary. Melanie accused him of using her desperation to protect her own reputation as leverage against her. What had started, months earlier, as Melanie recruiting Adrian's help to access confidential business information had curdled into something closer to mutual blackmail. Eric had, by the end of that recording, more evidence than he needed: proof of the manufactured accusation against Bella, proof of the disabled camera, proof of the leaked business information, and proof, undeniable and damning, of exactly who had orchestrated all of it. He could have confronted her that same night. Some part of him wanted to. Instead he waited. The pre-wedding gathering was 2 days away, filled with the guests whose approval had always mattered most to Melanie, the people in front of whom her carefully built identity would mean the most and cost the most to lose. If she was going to reveal who she really was, Eric decided, she would do it in front of every person who had ever believed the version of her she'd spent years perfecting. The mansion had been transformed for the occasion. White orchids threading up the staircase, a string quartet warming up in the ballroom, more than 200 guests moving through rooms lit gold by candlelight. Melanie moved through the crowd like she'd been born for exactly this moment, radiant, gracious, delivering a toast about love and loyalty that drew warm applause from a room that had no idea what was coming. Eric watched her from across the room and said nothing until the toast had finished and the guests had turned, expectant, toward him. He stood. The room quieted the way rooms do for men who rarely need to raise their voice to be heard. "Before we celebrate anything further," he said, "there's something you all need to hear." He played the recording. Melanie's voice filled the ballroom, cold, precise, threatening a woman for telling the truth, and Eric watched 200 faces shift from confusion to horrified recognition in real time. Melanie's expression cracked in a way he had genuinely never seen before, the practiced composure finally, completely failing her. She tried to explain. He let her finish, and then, without raising his voice, he laid out the rest. The disabled camera, the manufactured evidence, the meetings with Adrian, the leaked acquisition details. Each piece landed heavier than the last. Melanie's final attempt was to turn the room against Bella, to insist the maid had somehow manipulated him into believing a story built entirely from misunderstanding. Eric stopped her with 4 words that would follow her for the rest of her social life. "You lost me tonight," he said, "the moment you decided an innocent woman was worth sacrificing to protect a lie." He removed his ring. He did not raise his voice again. The wedding, in every sense that mattered, was already over. Downstairs, unaware that any of this had happened, Bella had continued working, checking on the catering staff, making sure the night ran smoothly for guests who had no idea she was the reason it had unraveled at all. When Eric finally sent for her, she walked into the ballroom expecting a task, not an audience. Every face in that room turned toward her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, no one looked through her. They saw her name attached to a truth that had cost her almost everything to protect, and for one unguarded moment, Bella Lewis stood in the center of a room that had spent months failing to notice she existed at all. Read what happens next. The final chapter reveals exactly what Eric offers her, and why it changes both of their lives for good. You won't want to miss the ending. Melanie left the estate before sunrise the next morning, trailed by a small, humiliated procession of movers and a silence no amount of practiced grace could soften. The investigation into Adrian Cole began within the week, quiet and thorough, the way Eric handled everything that actually mattered to him. Bella's name was cleared completely, publicly, without a shred of ambiguity left attached to it. Eric did not offer her money as an apology. He'd thought about it briefly and decided it would be exactly the wrong gesture, a payment for silence dressed up as kindness, when what she deserved was something closer to recognition. Instead, he offered her a position overseeing operations at one of his luxury properties. Full training, a real career path, the kind of opportunity she had quietly set aside years earlier so her brother could have his. Bella hesitated. She told him honestly that she didn't want anyone assuming she'd been handed a position out of pity, or guilt, or the awkward debt of a man who'd once let his household nearly destroy her. "I'm not offering you this because of what happened with Melanie," Eric told her. "I'm offering it because I've spent months watching how you work. This has nothing to do with pity. It has everything to do with the fact that you're better at reading a room, solving a problem, and protecting the people around you than half the executives on my payroll." Bella accepted. Marcus celebrated with the kind of pride that made the years of sacrifice feel, finally, worth every bit of what they'd cost her. Mrs. Brooks told her, gruffly in the way she reserved for things she meant most, that she'd always known Bella was capable of more than a uniform and a mop cart. Eric, for his part, spent those same months reckoning with a harder truth. His mistake had never been loving the wrong person. It was assuming a polished public performance told him anything real about a person's private character. A blind spot that had nearly cost his company millions and had already cost an innocent woman weeks of quiet terror. Months later, Bella walked through the marble lobby of one of Eric's properties in a tailored blazer instead of a housekeeping uniform, reviewing a tablet full of the kind of decisions she'd once only been allowed to clean up after. Eric saw her from across the room and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with business. He didn't see a maid. He never really had, not in any way that mattered. He simply hadn't been looking closely enough to notice what he was missing. He saw Bella Lewis. A woman who had spent years believing invisibility was simply the shape her life was required to take, and who had discovered, the hard way, the costly way, that being overlooked was never the same thing as being powerless. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the background isn't waiting to be rescued. They're waiting for someone with enough power to finally notice what they were capable of all along. If this story moved you, you're going to want to see where Bella and Eric go from here. The next chapter of their story is already waiting. Follow along so you don't miss it and tell me in the comments. Did you see Melanie's betrayal coming, or did it hit you the same way it hit Eric?